How did a medieval English peasant, having neither modern tools nor building materials nor engineering knowledge, build a dwelling capable of resisting icy winds and penetrating frosts? We imagine their homes as flimsy windswept shacks where winter survival was a miracle. But what if this squat old house was not a primitive hovel, at a pinnacle of organic architecture, a brilliant engineering solution honed over centuries for a single purpose: to preserve precious heat? This story takes you to a world where building was not a craft, but an art of survival, a complex system of knowledge about landscape, materials, and the laws of nature. This is the story of how our ancestors, using only what the forest and the earth gave them, created not just walls and roofs, but real living organisms that breathed, warmed, and protected. How did they choose a place for a house? By reading the wind and sun. Why was curved wood better than straight wood? And how could a house built without a single nail be the most effective heat trap? Today, we will reveal 10 ingenious principles that were at the heart of medieval peasant house construction. These are 10 secrets that allowed people not just to survive the winter, but to create a stable and warm shelter in the midst of a hostile world. Have you had to learn that the humble hut was a marvel of engineering? And let that start. The first and most important stage of construction began long before the first trunk was cut, where the first hole was dug. It began with a silent but intense dialogue with the earth, the wind, and the sun. The choice of a place for a house was not a matter of a beautiful view or convenience, but a fundamental survival strategy, the first and main line of defense against the winter cold. The medieval peasant, whose life depended on these decisions, read the landscape with the same meticulousness with which we read a complex engineering manual today. It was an art based on generations of observation. The ideal location was the south or southeast slope of a low, gentle hill. This location offered to huge invaluable advantages. First, it was free passive solar energy. The house with its long side facing south during the short winter day, when the sun hung low over the horizon, caught every precious ray on its wattle-and-daub roof, greedily soaking up its warmth. Secondly, the very mass of the hill behind the back of the house served as a powerful natural shield. It took the brunt of the prevailing cold and wet north and northwest winds, which brought with them the most brutal frost and snowstorms. The peasant instinctively, with an almost animal instinct, avoided the picturesque lowlands and river valley bottoms. These places, seemingly cozy and protected in summer, turned into death traps of cold and winter, cold air being denser and heavier than warm air at night. Like an invisible icy river flowed down from the surrounding hills and accumulated in these lowlands. So, called frost pockets were formed here, where the temperature could be 5 or even 10 lower than on the slope, just a few tens of meters higher. Frost lay longer. Here in the fogs were thicker and colder. Proximity to the forest was also critical, but here too moderation was observed. The forest was a source of building materials and fuel, as well as another giant wind barrier. A strip of trees a few hundred meters north of the house could significantly weaken the force of the icy winds. But building the house close to the forest was dangerous. It attracted predators and created constant shade, dampness, and fire danger. Finally, hydrology was taken into account. The house was built close enough to a stream or well, but on a natural elevation or slope to ensure good drainage. A shallow gutter was often built around the house to drain rainwater, running off the roof to keep the base of the walls dry. This thoughtful, holistic approach solved half of the heating and safety problems in advance, making nature itself the chief architect and die. The hardened skeleton of most medieval English peasant houses was a unique and ingeniously simple structure known as the CRUC frame. It was a technology perfectly adapted to limited resources and simple tools, allowing for an incredibly strong and durable structure without a single expensive metal nail. Crack was a pair of large solid tree trunks, usually oak for its strength and resistance to decay, that had a natural bend. Finding 10 merely identical curved trees was a great stroke of luck and required the carpenter to have intimate knowledge of his forest. The selected trunk was handsman sawed lengthwise into 2 mirrored halves with a long saw, or more labor-intensive split with wooden wedges. These 2 massive curved beams, like giant rinsewood, placed on a solid stone basin joint at the top to form a giant A. This A-minus frame was the main load-bearing structure of the entire house, taking the entire weight of the roof. It could be 2, 3, or 4 such frames depending on the length of the house. They were connected by a long ridge beam that ran across the top in several rows of side POL. The genius of this system was its remarkable efficiency and economy of material. The peasant did not have to search for perfectly straightened long logs, which were rare, and went to the needs of a lord for building castles or ships. He searched the forest for trees that had already grown with the right curve. The curved shape of the crack naturally created both the sloping line of the walls and the basis for the steep gable roof in a single solid element. This gave the house incredible strength and resistance to hurricane winds and the weight of wet snow. All joints in such a frame were made with the help of complex carpenter's notches, studs and grooves which were carved with an axe and chisel and fixed with thick oak dowels. The timber for the frame was often green, freshly cut. It was softer and easier to work, and as it dried in the finished structure, though it dried a little and all the joints were tightened even tighter, creating a monolithic but slightly elastic structure. Assembled on the ground, this heavy frame was then lifted by the entire community with the help of levers, ropes, and loud shouts. The frame on the crotch was not just a set of logs, but a powerful skeleton ready to take on the thick protective skin of the walls and roof. Once the mighty oak skeleton of the house was erected, it was time to build up the flesh, the walls. And here medieval builders used another ancient and ingenious technology known as wattle-and-daub. These walls were not just a barrier from the outside world, but an active, breathing element of the home's climate control capable of storing heat, regulating humidity, and creating a healthy microclimate. First, between the vertical posts and horizontal PLL end of the framel, a space wattle was created. For this purpose, thick stakes made of oak or ash were driven into the ground and into the beams at a distance of about half a meter from each other. These stakes were then tightly and carefully interwoven with thinner and more flexible twigs, most often from hazel or willow. These twigs were used freshly cut as long as they remained flexible. The process was similar to weaving a giant basket. The result was a strong and resilient, yet lightweight base ready to be sheathed. And the whole community, men, women, and even children, would begin to knead the daub. This was a real alchemy, the recipe for which varied from region to region. The base was local clay, which served as a binder and had a high heat capacity. Large amounts of chopped straw, hay, and sometimes even moss or wool shavings were added to it, which worked as reinforcing fibers to prevent the wall from cracking as it dried. The most important component was fresh cow dung. It not only contained indigestive fibers, which worked as additional reinforcement, but also, thanks to enzymes, served as a natural plasticizer and glue, making the mixture more viscous and sticky. This thick, viscous mixture was manually poured over the wicker base on both sides, carefully pressing it into the lattice so that no voids remained. The thickness of the walls could reach 20-30 cm. The surface was then leveled with the wooden board, adjusted pans and left to dry. After drying, the walls were often covered with lime whitewash. Lime not only gave the house an white look, but also served as an antiseptic and created an additional water-repellent layer. The annual spring ritual was to put fresh clay over the cracks that appeared over the winter, keeping the thermal circuit of the house in perfect condition. If the walls were the skin of the house, the roof was its thick woolen coat, its main and most important shield against cold, rain, and snow. Modern calculations show that it is through the roof, but up to 30 to 40% of all heat loss in a poorly insulated building occurs. And medieval peasants, not knowing the exact figures, understood this intuitively, so they created an incredibly effective insulation from the most affordable and renewable material available, thatch or straw. A thatched roof was not just a covering, but a massive multi-layered insulation system. Its thickness with staggering could reach a meter or more, especially on older houses where new layers were laid on top of worn-out old ones. The construction of such a roof was an art, and a good thatcher was worth his weight in gold. The layer of twigs and branches was first laid on rafters made of thin poles. hen, straw, wheat, or rye, or even better, long-stem water reeds were laid, starting at the bottom from the roof overhang and moving up to the ridge. Each bundle was tied tightly to the batten with soaked ropes of vegetable fibers or thin willow rods. The layers were laid overlapping like the scales of a giant fish at a very steep angle so that water would roll down as fast as possible before it had time to penetrate. The main secret of insulation lay in its structure. Aliens of hollow straw or reed stalks in tightly packed layers created a huge number of tiny air pockets. It was this still-trapped air that was the perfect insulator. It prevented the precious heat from the hearth, which always rose upwards from escaping outside. This thick coat also effectively protected from the summer heat, keeping the inside cool. This system had another ingenious side effect. The smoke from the central hearth without a chimney slowly seeped through the lower layers of the thatch roof. This smoke, rich in CRESOT and other terry substances, acted as a powerful preservative. It impregnated the thatch, making it unattractive to insect pests, mice, and birds, as well as preventing the growth of mold, mildew, and rot. Thus, the smoke that was an integral part of the heating system simultaneously worked to preserve the roof itself, extending its life for many years. A heavy, thick, tarred, and smoke roof was the perfect armor that kept the heat inside and the cold and moisture outside. In the constant battle against the cold, the medieval builder used not only what grew on the ground, but also the earth itself as a building material and natural insulator. One of the oldest and most effective techniques, especially in the early Middle Ages, was the partial burial of the house in the ground. This type of structure, known to archaeologists as a gruben house or recessed floor house, was an ingenious way to harness the planet's free and constant heat energy for protection from the cold. Instead of erecting the house directly on the surface, the builders dug a rectangular pit 50 cm to a meter deep. The floor of the future dwelling is thus much lower than the freezing level of the soil. Already at this stage, a colossal gain in heat saving was achieved. The Earth has tremendous thermal inertia. Below a certain depth, its temperature remains almost stable all year round. At PLU rate 8 plates. Even at shallower depths, the ground cools much slower than air and rarely freezes through in a mild English winter. By sinking his house into the ground, the farmer effectively insulated the lower, most vulnerable part of the walls from direct contact with the icy air and penetrating wind. Instead of coming into contact with the atmosphere where the temperature might have been flat pox or 10, the walls were in contact with the ground where the temperature was around 0 degrees or even higher. This radically reduced heat loss through the floor and the base of the wall. The wind could not physically blow heat out from under the house. The excavated earth was often not taken away, but used to create a low berm around the above-ground part of the walls, which further strengthened the insulation. Besides, such a construction was simply more economical. It required less material to build the walls, as a significant part of them was formed by the earth itself. The walls of the excavation were sometimes reinforced with wooden boards or wattles to prevent crumbling. The house became squat low with a smaller area of exterior walls, which also reduced heat loss. Living in such a semi-minus, subterranean space created a special sense of security and comfort. A feeling of being in a protected hole in the womb of Mother Earth was not a sign of poverty but a highly rational and energy-efficient solution that allowed one to survive the harshest winters with minimal consumption of precious fuel. The medieval peasant, whose survival depended entirely on crops and would have lived in perfect harmony with the cycles of nature, and his house was not just a static box, but a kind of precise instrument tuned to the daily and annual movement of the sun across the sky. The orientation of the dwelling to the sides of the world was not accidental, but a carefully considered fundamental strategy for passive solar heating, the secrets of which are now being rediscovered by green architects. As a rule, the long house had its long axis in the east-west direction. This seemingly simple solution was of great importance for the thermal balance of the building. In this orientation, one of the long walls of the house faced strictly south and the other north. The south wall became the main passive solar collector. Throughout the short winter day, when the sun moves on a low trajectory in the south, its rays fell on this wall at a nearly right angle, maximizing the transfer of thermal energy. The dark earthy cold earthen wall having low reflectivity albedo and high thermal inertia G really absorbed this heat, accumulated it in its mass, and then slowly during the long evening and night hours radiated it inside the house. It was on this southern warm wall that the few and tiny windows, if any, were made. These small openings let in not only scanty light, but also direct sunlight which brightly stained the earthen floor, warming and the interior decoration. In summer, when the sun was high, the wide overhang of the thatched roof cast a shadow on the south wall, protecting it from overheating. The northern wall, on the contrary, was cold and deaf. In winter it received almost no direct sunlight and was most vulnerable to the icy northern winds. That is why they tried to make it as solid as possible without any openings that would become cold bridges. Often a stable, a peat shed, or a wood pile was attached to the house from the northern side, which served as an additional unheated buffer, protecting the living area from the cold. The entrance to the house was most often unlocated on the east or west end wall, sometimes on the south wall, but almost never on the north wall. Such an elaborate layout turned the house into an effective heat trap. It was open to the life minus, giving heat from the south and sealed tightly against the deadly cold from the north. One of the most iconic and ingenious architectural designs of medieval northern Europe was the longhouse. It was not just a building tradition, but an elaborate multi-minus functional survival system that elegantly solved one of the main problems of winter heating. The design of the house was originally intended to have a built-minus and living, self-minus regulating, and totally free heating system in the form of livestock. Architecturally, a longhouse was an elongated rectangular structure under one common continuous roof. The interior space was most often divided into two parts, not by a capital wall, but only by a light wicker partition, a wooden barrier, or simply an open passage called a cross passage. Fine. Usually the more prestigious and cleaner part was where people lived. This part was called the hall. The other, often located a little lower down the natural slope of the train, contained the peasant's most valuable asset, his livestock, a cow, a couple of oxen, a few sheep. This part was called byre stable. This close proximity, which today seems to us the height of unsanitation, was the key to survival. Large farm animals generate enormous amounts of metabolic heat as they digest their food. By integrating the stable directly into the structure of the dwelling, the farmer prevented this heat from being wasted. The heat from the animals heated their part of the house and then passed through a light airtight partition and through the air to the living half unimpeded. The wall between man and livestock became a permanent 24- or low-temperature radiator. In addition, the floor in the living area hall was often 15-20 cm higher than in the stable byre. If thus dictated not only by elementary hygiene to prevent sight from the stable from reaching people, but also by the laws of physics. Warm air from the animals, being lighter than cold air, naturally rose upwards and freely penetrated into the human half. The result was a constant, albeit weak, natural flow of heat in the house from the lower animal end to the upper human end. This was an ingenious symbiosis inherent in the architecture itself. People gave animals protection from bad weather and predators, and in return, animals shared with people not only food and draft power, but also their invaluable warmth of life, helping them to survive the fiercest frosts. The constant sounds and smells of living creatures behind the wall were not an irritant, a soothing reminder of life and well-being. The main enemy of warmth in any home is the uncontrolled infiltration of cold air or simply a draft. Any hole in the wall is a gap in the defense through which precious hard minus and heat escapes and the icy wind enters. The medieval builder understood this more than anyone else. So, the entire construction strategy was aimed at creating the most airtight, almost sealed fortress with as few holes as possible. There were practically no windows in the modern sense in a peasant's house. Glass was an incredible over-minus, the minus-top luxury available only for stained glass in cathedrals and windows in the castles of the richest lords. The peasant could not afford it. Therefore, windows were even not made at all, preferring to live in cozy semi-minus darkness by the light of the hearth, where they were tiny, not bigger than a head of openings in the wall. A main function was not insulation, but minimal ventilation and the possibility to look out to assess the weather or to see who was approaching the house. At night, and for the whole winter period, these halls were plugged with a bundle of straw, old rags, or closed with penetrative wooden shutters inside and outside. Every extra opening was an unacceptable luxury, a hole in the thermal circuit of the house. The door was the second weak point. To minimize heat loss, the doorway was as low and narrow as possible. All person had to bend down to get in, but this drastically reduced the amount of cold air that rushed in every time the door was open. The door itself was massive, made of thick rough boards, and often had no metal hinges, but rotated on simple wooden spikes embedded in the threshold invested. It was locked from the inside with a heavy limiting deadbolt. For additional sealing from inside, a heavy cowhide or several layers of dense felt were hung on the doorway for the winter, creating a kind of vestibule or a curtain, which damped the draft. The only technologically necessary opening apart from the door was a hole in the roof for the smoke to escape. It was also made as small as possible, just enough to ensure a minimum draft and prevent the family from suffocating with carbon monoxide. It was located not directly above the hearth, but a little to the side so that rainwater would not drip directly into the fire. Often a simple wooden flap on a pole was provided to partially cover the opening during strong winds or blizzards. This strategy of total tightness turned the house into a dark but warm shelter, a veritable cocoon safely protected from the hostile outside world. A central hearth was not just a place to build a fire. It was designed and built as the physical and spiritual heart of the house, its main heat reactor and center of social life. Its design and layout were the result of centuries of experience aimed at maximizing heat output, versatility, and safety in a home without a chimney. Unlike the later wall-mounted fireplace, which inefficiently warms one wall, the hearth was always placed in the center of a single room. This was a key architectural decision. This arrangement allowed the radiant heat from the fire to spread evenly in all directions, 360, warming the floor, the walls, and all the people wherever they were. This created a single heat field with cooking in the center and sleeping on working around the edges. The construction of a hearth began with careful preparation of the foundation. A shallow hole was dug in the earthen floor, which was filled with rubble or broken stone for drainage, so that moisture from the ground would not rise to the fire. A thick layer of greasy clay was carefully tamped on top of the drainage. The clay gradually drying out and being burnt by the daily fire became as hard as a ceramic pot and created a reliable fireproof cushion that prevented the straw bedding on the floor from catching fire. On the perimeter of this clay circle was oft inlaid a low border of flat, specially selected river stones or flagstones. These stones not only kept the coals and ashes inside the hearth boundaries, but also worked as an important element of the heat accumulator. Heated by the fire during the day, they continued to slowly and gently release the accumulated heat long after the flames died down, creating a comfortable microclimate around them. The main hearth sign, the largest and flattest, was often considered sacred, the guardian spirit of the house. Having such a specially prepared, slightly elevated, and fireproof location was critical. It concentrated the fire at one point, making it more manageable and safer. All life in the house was organized around this heat center. The center hearth design was the epitome of simplicity and ingenious efficiency, an ideal solution for a one-room dwelling where each element had to perform several functions at once. No peasant house in the Middle Ages was built alone. Perhaps the most important, though completely invisible building technology was not wood or clay, but the strength of the peasant community. Erecting a new house for a young family, for the burned out or newcomers, was a collected endeavor in which the whole village participated directly or indirectly. It was not just neighborly help, but part of an unwritten but unbreakable social contract, a system of mutual obligations known as boonwort, the basis of survival in a world where one could only die alone. The building process was divided into stages, and each stage required collective strength. The harvesting of wood, especially the massive curved cracks for the frame, required the coordinated efforts of several experienced men. They would go to the forest together, fell the selected wood together with axes and wedges, and trim it together. Transportation of these heavy multi-ton logs from forest to village was only possible collectively using the pulling power of oxen owned by several families and simple but effective levers and rollers. The culmination of the construction and a real celebration for the whole village was the day the frame was lifted. The minus frames assembled on the ground were incredibly heavy. Only a large group of men acting as a single organism under the rhythmic commands of the head knitter, the most experienced carpenter, could lift them upright and put them in place. They used long poles with slings, strong hemp ropes, and their own muscle power. It was dangerous work requiring complete trust in each other. At the same time, women and children were doing equally important work. They turned into a living conveyor belt of dotting materials. Women were responsible for preparing dew wall clay. They brought dozens of buckets of water from the well, kneaded with bare feet, huge piles of clay with straw and dung to the right consistency. It was hard physical labor. The process of applying clay to the wattle and daub was also a team effort that allowed the walls to be erected quickly in a few days while the weather was dry. The children did not sit idle either. They collected moss for caulking cracks, carried stones for the foundation, and trampled clay. In this way, through playing as much help as they could, they absorbed the building skills of their ancestors from a young age. The same was true for the roof. Covering the roof with a thick layer of thatch was hard and laborious work requiring a whole brigade. Some below prepared and fed the sheavi. Others standing on rickety scaffolding received them, and the most experienced master roofer laid and fixed the thatch forming a dense waterproof shell. But construction did not end with the erection of a house. The annual collective repair was an equally obligatory ritual. Every fall before the onset of cold weather, the community helped each other to inspect and treat the houses. Men climbed on the roofs, checking and patching thatch gaps. Women prepared fresh clay and sealed cracks in the walls that had appeared over the summer. This mutual aid was the most reliable insurance. The peasant knew that if his house was damaged by a storm or fire, he would not be left with his family in the open air. The community was his main construction team, mutual aid funded repair service. And this social technology based on trust and mutual responsibility was stronger than any oak plank and more reliable than any stone wall. The medieval peasant house was not just a primitive hut. Was a marvel of organic architecture and engineering born out of a deep understanding of nature and stern necessity. Every decision from the choice of location on a sunny slope to the design of the chimney was subordinated to one great goal: to preserve life and warmth. Our ancestors built homes that were alive. They breathed through clay walls, basked in the warmth of the earth and sun, used their animals as built-minus and batteries. They created not just shelter but a holistic ecosystem for survival where every element, wood, clay, straw, and the community itself was part of a single ingenious design. It did not fight nature but allied with it, using its laws for their own benefit. As we study their experience, we see that the most sustainable and effective solutions do not always require sophisticated technologies and expensive materials. Sometimes they lie in wisdom, attention to the world around us, and most importantly in the power of human unity. The story of the peasant house is not a tale of poverty, but a hint to human adaptation, ingenuity, and indomitable spirit. If you are interested in this journey into the world of medieval architecture, and you want to know more about how our ancestors solved seemingly insoluble problems, give us a like and subscribe to our channel. There are many more amazing stories about forgotten tricks and ingenious ideas born in the depths of centuries ahead of you. Have you ever looked at the majestic, imposing walls of a medieval English castle and thought about how impossibly cold it must have been? Forget the storybook images of noble lords and ladies drinking mulled wine by a roaring fire. That's a lie. A beautiful, comforting lie that Hollywood and fairy tales have sold you. The truth is far colder, far crueler. The day we complain about a cold draft from a window, they fought a daily desperate battle for survival against a fortress that was actively trying to freeze them to death. To think you're tough because you took a cold shower? Try having to take a dump in a hole in the wall with a gale force wind blowing straight up your ass. So, were they tougher than us? Predicts and secrets for enduring this brutal reality that we can't even begin to comprehend. Let's stop pretending and look at the real icy truth. This is not a fairy tale. It is a story of cold, damp, and survival. The castle's buttery was a vital storage area for food and drink, but it was also often located in the deepest, coldest part of the castle. This was not a flaw. It was a deliberate choice. The cold, damp environment of the under-buttery was ideal for preserving food, especially beer, wine, and dairy products. However, this meant that the servants who worked in this area were subjected to a constant chilling cold. Their hands and feet would often be numb, and the work was slow and painful. Food was preserved by the cold, but the people who tended to it were consumed by it. The under-buttery was a microcosm of the medieval castle's brutal logic and needs of the castle, in this case, food preservation, always came before the comfort or even health of the individual serving it. The thick stone walls which made the castle so secure also made the under-buttery an excellent natural refrigerator. This cold was a blessing for the food, but a curse for the workers. The dampness that seeped in from the ground made the cold feel even more intense, and the lack of sunlight meant that the workers were often in a state of perpetual gloom and cold. They often worked by the dim light of a tallow candle, their breath visible in the frigid air. The physical toll of this work was immense, leading to chronic joint pain and other cold-related ailments. The constant exposure to cold, damp conditions was a slow but steady assault on the body, a price that had to be paid for the preservation of the castle's winter provisions. This brutal reality underscores the fact that the castle was a machine of survival, and the human cost of its efficiency was often very high. The scent of spilled ale, fermenting cheese, and aging meats mingled with the earthy smell of the stone, a heavy cloying perfume that defined the space. For workers wore layers of rough wool and leather, but nothing could truly protect them from the cold that seemed to seep into their very bones. They moved with a slow, deliberate caution, as a dropped barrel of precious wine could mean a week's wages lost. The under-buttery was a world unto itself, a place where time seemed to slow down, and the only reality was the cold. The daily tasks were a litany of small misery, rolling heavy casks of ale, cutting slabs of hard cheese with numb fingers, and carefully decanting wine without spilling a drop. The cold made every muscle ache, and the lack of proper footwear meant their feet were often frostbitten and sore. They would wrap their hands in rags, a futile attempt to retain some dexterity, but the work was still agonizing. The silence of the under-buttery was oft unpunctuated by the low grunts of effort and the splash of liquid sounds that echoed in the stone chamber. The workers were a silent, unseen army toiling in the depths of the castle to ensure the survival of the people above. Their existence was a stark reminder of the social hierarchy, a place where the comfort of the lord and his family was bought with the constant suffering of the lowest-ranking servants. The cold of the under-buttery was not a temporary discomfort. It was a permanent condition of their working life, a price paid in pain and suffering for the sake of the castle's winter lord. The cold was a master as demanding as any lord, and its demands were met with a silent, stoic endurance. It was a cold that never truly left them, a chill that would follow them even into the brief warmth of a communal fire, a phantom pain that was a constant companion. The under-buttery was a place of sacrifice, a cold, dark heart of a castle where survival was paramount and humanity was a luxury. The medieval diet was not just about stews and porges. It was also about hot foods and spices. Spices like ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and pepper were highly praised not just for their flavor, but for their perceived ability to warm the body from within. These expensive spices were often used in mulled wines and hearty dishes to create a feeling of internal warmth that helped people withstand the external cold. The spices were a form of internal heating, a luxury that was reserved for the wealthy and a crucial part of their survival strategy. The use of spices was a form of self-medication against the cold. Finally, now know that spices don't actually raise the body's core temperature. The sensation of warmth they provided was a powerful psychological comfort. The high cost of these spices meant that they were a clear marker of social status. A wealthy lord could afford to have his wine mulled with cinnamon and cloves, while a common soldier had to make do with a cold, watery ale. The spices were not just a flavor enhancer. They were a symbol of a person's ability to fight back against the cold. The act of drinking a hot spice beverage was a daily ritual for the nobility, a moment of luxury and warmth in a world of pervasive cold. This reliance on expensive imports for basic comfort highlights the stark class divide in medieval society. The poor had to rely on their own body heat and physical labor to stay warm, while the rich could literally buy a feeling of warmth. The aroma of these spices wafting from the kitchens and into the great hall was a sensory beacon of winter comfort, a smell that spoke of wealth and security. The preparation of these spiced dishes and drinks was a labor-intensive process, acquiring the careful grinding of peppercorns, the shaving of nutmeg, and the slow simmering of wine. The kitchens with their massive hearths were a hive of activity, and the warmth they generated was a welcome byproduct. The kitchen staff, while working hard, at least had the benefit of being in the warmest part of the castle. The spices themselves were a commodity of immense value, often transported from distant lands at great risk and expense. A small pouch of peppercorns could be a dowry, and a cask of spiced wine a generous gift. The very presence of these spices in the castle was a testament to the lord's power and reach. The psychological effect of the spices cannot be overstated. In a world where cold was a constant and relentless enemy, the momentary sensation of warmth from a spiced drink was a powerful morale booster, a reminder that the winter would not last forever. It was a form of escapism, a brief journey to a warmer, more exotic world. This ritualistic consumption of hot foods was a form of resistance, a daily act of defiance against the harshness of the medieval winter. For monks and scribes in a castle or monastery, the scriptorium was a brutally cold place. They would spend hours hunched over manuscripts, their fingers often too numb to hold a pen. The scriptorium was often located in a high, airy part of the building to maximize natural light, which made it incredibly cold in winter. Ink could freeze and parchment could become stiff and brittle. The only way to combat this was to work in the rare sunbeam from a window or to have a small bee razor nearby. Their work was a testament to the human will to create in the face of a hostile environment. The cold was an enemy not just to the body but to the very craft of writing. The ink, often made from gall nuts and other organic materials, would thicken and congeal in the cold, making it impossible to write with. The parchment, made from animal skin, would contract and become stiff, making it difficult to smooth out and write on. The scribe's hands, often a source of great pride and skill, would become numb and painful, making the delicate work of illumination and calligraphy a monumental struggle. The small brazier with its limited heat and smoky fumes was a vital lifeline for these workers, providing just enough warmth to keep the ink flowing and their fingers pliable. The dedication required to produce these beautiful manuscripts in such harsh conditions is hard for us to imagine today. The cold of the scriptorium is not a passive discomfort. It was an active force that threatened to stop the work of preserving knowledge. The scribes were not just fighting the cold. They were fighting for the very survival of literacy and history. This daily battle in the scriptorium is a powerful reminder of the physical cost of intellectual and artistic pursuits in the Middle Ages. The cold was a constant companion to the men who created the written record of their time and is a testament to the resilience that so much of their work has survived. The silence of the scriptorium was broken only by the scratching of a quill, a sound that was a testament to a person's will against the cold. The need for precise, delicate work meant they could not wear thick gloves, forcing their fingers to be exposed to the biting air. The pain was a constant distraction, a fire in their knuckles and fingertips that had to be ignored in favor of the task at hand. The scribe's breath would hang in the air like a ghost, a visible sign of the cold that surrounded them. This very act of turning a page was a struggle as the brittle parchment would resist their numb fingers. Their work was a slow, deliberate form of torture, a beautiful creation born of immense physical hardship. The manuscripts they produced with their intricate details and flowing script are a testament not only to their skill but to their incredible endurance. The cold of the scriptorium was a test of faith and discipline, a daily ritual of suffering in the name of God and knowledge. It was a cold that shaped their work, making every line and every letter a victory against the elements. The scriptorium was a place of intellectual fire, but physical ice, a place where the human spirit burned brightly against the backdrop of a brutal, unforgiving winter. The stable staff had a particularly difficult winter. While the body heat of the horses provided some warmth, the stables themselves were often drafty and damp. The grooms had to work in the freezing cold, tending to the horses, mucking out stalls, and ensuring the animals had enough hay and water. The water buckets would freeze solid, and the hay could become damp and moldy. The stable staff, often the lowest paid members of the castle service staff, endured a particularly harsh winter, their hands oft unchapped and bleeding from the cold. The work began before dawn with the glow of a single tallow and a offering meager light as they chipped ice from water troughs and forked through frozen manure. Their clothes, simple woolen linen, offered little protection, and their feet, shod in worn leather boots, were perpetually cold and wet. The groom's greatest fear was a sick horse in winter, as a feverish animal would require constant, sleepless attention, and the chance of its survival was slim in the unforgiving cold. A stable yard, a churned-up sea of mud in warmer months, became a sheet of treacherous ice, making every trip with a heavy sack of oats a perilous journey. The smell of damp wool, straw, and horse sweat was a constant companion, a heavy, earthy scent that clung to them even after their brief cold water washes. The routine was relentless, a cycle of cold and labor that began and ended in darkness. They would often sleep in the loft above the stables, the thin floorboards offering little insulation from the cold below. The hay, their only source of warmth, was also a source of allergies and respiratory problems. The grooms were a hardy lot, but the winter was a test of their endurance. Playtime when a simple cold could turn into pneumonia, and a minor injury could become a life-threatening infection. The relationship between the grooms and the horses was one of mutual dependence. The horses relied on the grooms for their survival, and the grooms relied on the horses for their livelihood. A sick or injured horse was a financial disaster, and the grooms would go to extraordinary lengths to keep their charges healthy. They would often spend the night huddled in the stalls with a sick animal, using their own body heat to keep it warm, a selfless act of compassion born of necessity. The constant work with frozen materials took a toll on their bodies, their hands and backs aching from the strain. The tools they used, from shovels to pitchforks, were icy and heavy, and the cold made every movement a slow and painful effort. The stable was a place of constant noise and smell, the snorts and whinnies of the horses mixing with the earthy scent of hay and manure. In winter, the sensory experience was amplified by the cold, the smells more pungent, and the sounds more muted by the snow. The grooms were the unsung heroes of the castle, the people who worked in the shadows, their labor ensuring the mobility and power of the lord. Their winter hardship was a price paid for the castle's ability to function, a silent testament to the brutal realities of medieval life. The cold was a daily antagonist, a relentless enemy that had to be fought with every chore, a silent and constant threat to their health and their livelihood. Their lives were a cycle of physical labor and cold, a reality that only the coming of spring could truly break. The Das house, or communal sleeping quarters, was a reality for most of the castle's inhabitants. Servants, soldiers, and even low-ranking nobles often slept together in large rooms on straw-stuffed mattresses. This was not just for convenience. It was a form of communal heating. The combined body heat of a dozen or more people in a small enclosed space was a powerful source of warmth, a vital defense against the cold of the stone walls. This close-quarters living was a brutal but effective survival strategy. The straw rustled and shifted with every turn, and the air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and stale breath. Privacy was an unmanaged existent luxury. Yet the collective warmth was a prize worth the discomfort. The ritual of huddling together for the night was a silent agreement, a shared act of survival. Those on the edges of the group vied for a central spot, the warmest place, a nightly struggle that was resolved by a mix of seniority and brute force. This closeness also led to the rapid spread of illness. A cough from one corner of the room could become a plague by morning. Fact, in the face of the bone-chilling cold, a risk was one worth taking. The straw was changed only a few times a year, meaning it was a breeding ground for fleas and other vermin, and added discomfort to the already trying conditions. The shared body heat created a tangible microclimate, a small bubble of warmth against the overwhelming cold. The sound of snoring unsleep, minus talking, was a constant backdrop, a human symphony of survival. The social dynamics of the communal sleeping quarters were fascinating, uncomplex. It was a place where rank and title, so important during the day, often gave way to the more fundamental needs of survival. The high-ranking but small man might find himself on the edge, while a large, robust servant would command a central coveted spot. The hierarchy of the day was a fragile thing against the brutal reality of the cold. The act of huddling together was a form of enforced intimacy, a brutal camaraderie born of shared hardship. The nights were a time of whispers and rustling, of shared dreams and private nightmares. The thin blankets, often little more than rough wool, were a meager defense against the cold, and the shared body heat was the only true source of warmth. The morning routine was a testament to the night struggle, a chorus of groans and dates as people unangled themselves from the communal pile, their bodies stiff and sore from the cold and the awkward positions. The communal sleeping quarters were not a place of rest, but a place of survival, a nightly battle against the cold that left the inhabitants exhausted and vulnerable. The close quarters meant that a person's scent, their snoring, and their movements were a shared experience, a constant reminder of their collective existence. The winter was a time of forced community, a time when a person's very survival depended on their proximity to others. This brutal reality underscores the fact that the castle was a machine of survival, and the human cost of its efficiency was often very high. The constant threat of drafts. The medieval castle was a symphony of drafts, the ill-fitting doors, the gaps in the stone walls, the unglazed windows, and the large open spaces of the great hall all contributed to a constant whirling wind within the castle itself. This wasn't a gentle breeze. It was a cold, relentless current that could extinguish a candle or whip a person's cloak around. This constant wind chill made the cold feel even more intense, and it was a daily battle to find a spot that was free from the worst of the draft. The great hall, with its soaring ceilings and vast spaces, was a particular offender. The massive fireplaces, while impressive, often created a vortex of cold air, drawing in drafts from every corner. The only truly warm places were small private chambers high up in the towers, where the walls were thickest and the windows were narrow and carefully shuttered. But these were the domain of the lord and his family. The servants and guards had to find their own methods of defense. They would hang heavy tapestries and thick curtains over doorways, block gaps with rags and straw, and even create temporary partitions with salvage cloth. The drafts were so strong they could carry the smell of the kitchens from one end of the castle to the other, or the smoke from a distant fire. The sound of the wind whistling through the cracks was a constant low moan, a winter lullaby that never let you forget the cold. The drafts were a physical manifestation of the castle's vulnerability to the elements, a constant reminder that the stone walls were not an impenetrable barrier. The constant wind chill meant that the cold wasn't just a physical sensation, it was a psychological one, a constant source of discomfort and a reminder of the winter's power. The drafts were a form of white noise, a constant background hum of cold air that permeated every aspect of castle life. A person's cloak, a vital defense against the cold, was often more of a sail, catching the drafts and swirling them around the body. The cold air would find its way into the most private of spaces, a constant, unwelcome intruder. The simple act of walking down a corridor could be a struggle against a sudden gust of wind, and the sound of a door slamming shut was a common occurrence. The drafts were also a fire hazard, as a stray ember could be carried by the wind and start a fire in a bundle of straw or a tapestry. The castle, for all its grand design, was a fraud machine, a series of interconnected stone boxes that were constantly being assaulted by the winds. The drafts were a constant invisible enemy, a force that had to be reckoned with every day. The low moan of the wind through the cracks in the stone walls was a sound that defined the winter, a mournful and relentless song that spoke of the cold's power. It was a sound that could follow a person into their tunes, a constant reminder of the brutal reality of the medieval winter. The constant fight against the drafts was a collective effort, a silent and unspoken agreement to make the castle as livable as possible. It was a battle that was never truly won, only endured until the spring thaw offered a temporary reprieve. Winter was a time when all the construction on the castle would cease. The mortar would freeze before it could set, and the risk of accidents from falling as or unstable scaffolding was too high. The stone quarries would also freeze over, making it impossible to extract new stone. This meant that any construction project, no matter how urgent, would be put on hold for several months, leaving the castle as a half-modest finished, even colder and more drafty structure. The winter was a period of stagnation and hardship, a time when progress was impossible. The stonemasons and laborers whose work was dependent on the weather were often laid off for the season, forced to find other work or simply go without. This seasonal unemployment was a predictable but brutal reality, and it often meant a period of severe hunger for their families. The half-finished walls open to the elements became a repository for snow and ice, which would then thaw and refreeze, causing further damage to the masonry. Castle's unfinished state was a visual representation of the winter's grip, a reminder that the world was on hold until the spring thaw. The scaffolding, left exposed, had become a dangerous jungle of ice-slicked wood, a hazard to anyone who ventured too close. The tools of the trade, from chisels to hammers, would be carefully stored and oiled to prevent rust, a quiet acknowledgement of the winter's forestidleness. The cessation of work was not merely a logistical problem. It was a profound social and economic disruption. The skilled masons, men who could coax a shape from a raw block of stone with a few deft hammer blows, found their hands idle. Their expertise, so vital to the creation of the castle's grand walls and soaring arches, became useless in the face of nature's relentless cold. These master craftsmen, accustomed to the rhythmic clang of their tools and the satisfying scrape of stone on stone, were now left to the monotony of waiting. The pride they took in their work and seeing a grand design slowly come to life out of their hands was replaced by a sense of powerlessness. They were not just builders, they were artists, and the winter was a period of forced creative dorm. For the common laborers, the impact was even more immediate and brutal. Their wages, meager even in the best of times, vanished entirely. They were the men who carried the heavy stones, mixed the mortar, and hauled the scaffolding into place. Their strength was their livelihood, and the winter stole it from them. The promise of food and warmth was replaced by the gnawing fear of an empty larder. Families huddled together in their small smoky hovels, rationing what little food they had stored. The children, their bellies aching with hunger, would look at their parents with a silent, pleading misery. The father, a man whose muscles were hard as iron from a life of toil, would feel a deeper ache in his heart than any physical pain, a profound sense of failure as he watched his family suffer. The winter was a cruel accountant, tallying up the cost of every day without work in the form of hunger and cold. The cold seeped into everything, a pervading, demoralizing force. The very air around the construction site seemed to hold a heavy frozen silence, a stark contrast to the lively clamor of hammers and shouting that characterized the summer months. The ghostly skeletal remains of the scaffolding stood as a silent testament to the work that had been and the work that was to come. It was a place of ghost-sunned echoes where one could almost hear the phantom sounds of a busy day's work. Now silenced by the snow, the tools so carefully put away seemed to wait with a patient resignation. The tea rose, their edges still smudged with dried mortar, lay in their boxes like sleeping birds. The mallets and chisels, a stonemason's most treasured possessions, were wrapped in oiled cloths, their sharp points and edges protected from the rust that would render them useless. This careful preservation was a small act of defiance against the winter's forestidleness, a hope that the spring would come and the work would resume. The winter also had a profound psychological impact on everyone involved. The sense of purpose and shared effort that animated the summer's work was replaced by a feeling of drift and uncertainty. The communal aspect of building where men worked side by side sharing stories and songs was gone. Each man was left to his own thoughts, his own anxieties. The long dark nights were a time for worry, for fretting over the future, for a deep-seated fear that the spring might not come soon enough, or that the work would not resume at all. The winter was a test of patience, a trial by solitude. The lord of the castle, a man of ambition and vision, would look out over his half-built fortress and feel a bitter frustration. His dream of a grand and impregnable home was literally frozen in time. The progress he so eagerly sought was at the mercy of the elements, a humbling lesson in the limits of power. The preparations for winter are a ritual of forced surrender. The last wagons of stone would be unloaded and carefully covered to protect them from the elements. The last of the mortar would be mixed in the bags of liments and would be stored in a dry, protected shed. The site would be secured as best as possible with temporary roofs and coverings put in place to shield vulnerable areas. But no amount of preparation could truly mitigate the damage and the delay. The sheer scale of the project meant that a significant portion of the castle was always exposed. The winter was a period of unavoidable loss, a time when the very act of not building was, in a sense, a form of demolition. The elements would slowly and methodically chip away at what had been accomplished, leading the spring crew with the task of not just building but of rebuilding. The very concept of time seemed to warp during the winter months. The days were short and dark. The hours dragged on. The feeling of forward momentum of a project moving towards a grand completion was replaced by a sense of being stuck, of a clock that had stopped. The men's lives, once dictated by the rising and setting of the sun and the steady rhythm of their work, now felt aimless and directionless. The winter was a great equalizer, reducing both master mason and common laborer to the same state of waiting. The only progress was the slow, inevitable creep of the sun's position, a promise that the days would eventually lengthen and the warmth would return. While we know today that alcohol doesn't actually warm the body, the medieval inhabitants of the castle believed it did. Hot-spiced wine or strong ale was a popular drink in winter. They believed that the alcohol and spices created a feeling of internal warmth and it was used as a way to combat the cold and boost morale. In reality, the alcohol thinned the blood and caused a person's body to lose heat more quickly. That in the absence of modern medicine and knowledge, it was a popular, albeit dangerous winter ritual. The brewing of ale was a continuous process even in the cold, as it was a staple of the diet and a safer alternative to often contaminated water. The spices used in the wine, such as cinnamon, cloves, and ginger, were not just for flavor. They were also believed to have medicinal properties and were a valuable commodity. This communal drinking was a social event, a way to share warmth and camaraderie in the face of the cold. The feasting and drinking in the great hall were a stark contrast to the rest of the castle, a momentary escape from the harsh reality of winter. That, for the guards on the battlements, or the stable staff, a swig of ale might have been the only source of warmth they had all day, a fleeting and dangerous comfort that could easily lead to a fatal fall or a lapse in judgment. The belief in alcohol's warming properties was deeply ingrained in the culture of the time. The initial flush of heat to the skin, a direct result of blood vessels dilating, is taken as proof of its effectiveness. This sensation, a deceptive warmth spreading from the core, was a powerful psychological comfort against the bone-deep chill. For those living in stone castles with little insulation, where drafts snake through every crack and crevice, this momentary respite was invaluable. The act of sharing a flagon of hot ale or a goblet of mulled wine was more than just a social convention. It was a defiant act against the brutal cold. The communal nature of the drinking was a form of solidarity, a way for people to huddle together both physically and emotionally against the common enemy of winter. The rich aroma as of cinnamon, cloves, and other precious spices filled the great hall, momentarily masking the musty scent of damp stone and stale air. These spices, imported at great expense, were a sign of wealth and status, and their use in winter drinks was a way to elevate a simple act of drinking into a luxurious and comforting ritual. The brewing of ale was a continuous and vital process, a constant source of life within the castle walls. Ale was not just an intoxicating beverage. It was a crucial part of the daily diet. The fermentation process killed harmful bacteria, making it a safer alternative to the often contaminated well water. It provided calories and nutrients, and for many, it was the only source of sustenance they had during lean times. The brewing master, a respected figure in the castle hierarchy, would work tirelessly in the brew house, a space kept perpetually warm by the large vats and drawing fires. The rhythmic bubbling of the fermenting mash was a reassuring sound, a sign that life and warmth continued despite the freezing temperatures outside. However, the warming properties of alcohol were a dangerous illusion. The same VA dilation that caused the feeling of warmth also lead to a rapid loss of core body heat. For a guard standing watch on the freezing battlements, a swig of ale might make him feel warm for a moment, but it would actually make him more susceptible to hypothermia. The alcohol's effect on judgment and motor skills was also a significant risk. A slip on an icy rampart or a misstep on a treacherous stone staircase could be fatal. The line between a comforting drink and a deadly mistake was thin, and in a world where survival was a daily struggle, it was a risk many were willing to take. The stable staff working in the cold and damp of the stables, I also rely on ale to get through the day. The false sense of warmth could lead them to underestimate the cold, resulting in frostbite or other cold-related injuries. The castle's inhabitants were wrapped in a cycle of misinformation, using a remedy that, providing a fleeting sense of comfort, ultimately put them in greater peril. The feasting in the great hall was a stark contrast to the grim reality of life outside. The high ceilings undrawing hearth provided a refuge from the cold, and the sound of laughter and music filled the air. It was a time to forget the hardships of winter, to celebrate life and community. But this warmth and conviviality were a temporary illusion. The moment a person stepped out of the great hall, the cold would rush in, a brutal reminder of the reality they were trying to escape. The winter was a time of stark contrast, of light and darkness, warmth and cold, life and death. The communal drinking of spiced wine and ale was a small fragile light in the overwhelming darkness of the cold, a testament to the human need for connection and comfort in the face of adversity. The spices, the wine, the ale, they were all part of a complex tapestry of survival, a mix of hope, ritual, and dangerous naivety that defined the medieval winter experience. The traditions born of necessity and passed down through generations were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even when facing a threat they didn't fully understand. The communal drinking was a way of reinforcing social bonds, a vital component of survival in a society where interdependence was not just a convenience but a necessity. The shared experience of drinking and feasting helped to build a sense of community, a feeling that they were all in this together, facing the long cold winter as a unified front. The cold had a brutal effect on the castle's weaponry and armor. Metal swords and spears would be icy to the touch, and the leather straps of a shield or armor would become stiff and brittle. A knight's chainmail would become so cold that putting it on was a shocking and painful experience. The cold also made the metal more brittle, increasing the risk of a weapon shattering in battle. The constant need to keep the weaponry from freezing was a crucial part of the armorer's job, a daily battle with the element. The armorer's workshop with its forge was a haven of warmth, and the armorer himself was a master of his craft. In fact, winter still presented unique challenges. The leather straps had to be regularly treated with tallow to keep them from cracking, and the metal weapons had to be kept close to the fire to prevent the extreme cold from making them too brittle to be effective. The armory itself was a cold and drafty space, and the armorer's hands, calloused and strong, were oft unchapped and red from the cold. The weight of the armor, already a burden, felt even heavier and more cumbersome in the cold, and a knight in full plate mail could barely move without assistance. The cold was an enemy as formidable as any army, and it was a daily struggle to keep the castle's defenses in a state of readiness. While the guards on the battlements were exposed to the worst of the cold, the battlements themselves were often a source of heat. Then we had the stone would freeze solid, but on a sunny day, the massive stone to absorb the sun's warmth and radiate it back out, providing a small but welcome source of warmth. It's of a form of passive heating that the builders did not intend, that the gods would have been grateful for. The battlements, a place of brutal defense, were also in a small way a source of comfort. The sun on the stone was a small miracle, a brief respite from the biting wind. The guards would often huddle together in the crenelles, the openings in the walls, trying to absorb as much of the sun's warmth as possible. The stone, the symbol of the castle's strength, also offered a small comfort to the men who stood on it. However, the warmth was fleeting, and as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the stone would begin to radiate cold. The guards would have to return to their small, crafty quarters. They would huddle together for warmth. The battlements, a place of constant vigilance, were a place of stark contrast, a place of both brutal cold and fleeting warmth. But survival in a medieval castle during a frosty winter was not an adventure, it was a brutal daily struggle. These are just some of the truths that hide behind the majestic stone walls of these fortresses. The people who lived there, from the king to the lowliest servant, were engaged in a constant battle with the elements. It's a testament to their resilience and will to survive, but it's a reality far from the romantic notions we often have. If you found this glimpse into the harsh realities of medieval life as fascinating as we do, make sure to hit that subscribe button on notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the forgotten corners of history.